Hey everybody, and welcome back to the show. Today's show is a little bit different, but of course absolutely related. Today I am sitting with Simon Cook, CEO of the Cannes Lions. Hello, Simon.
Hello there.
Thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having me.
So what Simon and I are going to talk about today is the Lions' inaugural Global CEO Forum, which was held, as of this recording, about a month ago at the Cannes Lions. And Simon and the team were gracious enough to have invited me to help facilitate and moderate the conversation and that took place that afternoon. So I want to kind of set it up for our listeners and our viewers so that you understand what happened. What happened was, under the Chatham House Rule, some 50 CEOs from around the world, from a portfolio of categories, industries from airline, media, entertainment, technology, CPG, beauty, retail, fashion, QSR, companies enormous and smaller still, came together to talk about creativity. But to talk about creativity not just in the context of marketing, but as a strategic business imperative and an essential, but often, as came out more than once, overlooked and underutilized lever of growth and value creation. The conversation went in a handful of areas, and Simon and I are going to touch on what we heard, what surprised us, and what we think is next. But broadly, it was a conversation about what creativity is, who's responsible for it within an organization, and how to ensure that an organization is better organized to ensure that creativity is facilitated, not stifled. But with that, Simon, and thanks again for being here. Tell us why you started this. Why was there an inaugural CEO forum?
Well, thanks for having me, Seth.
Yeah.
Also, thanks for being there on the day and facilitating things so graciously.
It was not the easiest room I've ever worked.
You did a gallant job, that's for sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So if we go back a few years, we started to notice that more and more CEOs were coming to the festival than ever before. And when we spoke to them and asked them, why are you here? You know, we were obviously used to the CMO being in town. Mm-hmm. Really interesting shift to see lots of CEOs showing up. And what they told us is that they were interested in understanding how they could leverage creativity as a growth driver. So a natural extension of that, why not pull them together? Why not host, as you said, the inaugural Global CEO Forum to explore it in more detail?
And as you look back on that kind of overarching question, how do we better leverage creativity as a growth driver? Do you think that they were saying, okay, it has been siloed within marketing, and therefore we want to kind of understand it from a marketing context and thus push it out from there more horizontally across the enterprise? Or what do you think was behind their inclination, which is to better understand it?
I think the role of it within marketing is one aspect, but also the role of creativity as a new frontier for growth. Because let's face it, and we spoke about this on the day, we talked about the immense pressure CEOs are under, that we're all under, to deliver incremental growth every year. Pressure to deliver growth for shareholders especially. And what we discussed on the day was the fact that some of these old levers for growth have been somewhat exhausted, depending on the profile of your company and where you're at.
And what are you thinking of there?
Well, it's transformation, M&A, scale, efficiency, all the classics, right?
Yeah.
So interesting to get together, and you know, it was great to see that people were really engaged with this conversation because they also wanted to explore how to leverage creativity. And interestingly, one of the CEOs told me that during their latest investor meeting, that came up for the first time. So he was asked, what is your strategy around creativity, which had not come up previously. So it's obviously a shift that we're seeing, but we also discovered on the day that world-class creative marketing outperforms the stock market by 8% every year. And it was also about giving some of these CEOs...
So sorry, unpack that data point because it's really interesting. So companies with world-class creative marketing, right, are outperforming their peers by 8% year over year as
Exactly
stock
that.
increase.
Exactly that.
But who sourced that?
So that was by an independent study
Okay.
done by one of our contributors. But I think the point we were trying to make, because we've heard these stats over the last decade or even longer, this is fresh information, fresh data points, and new ammunition, if you like, to do something about it. One of the things we explored in the room was this idea that I think all of the CEOs there were there because they truly believe that creativity could be leveraged. But of course, CEOs and businesses have lots of competing priorities.
Yes.
So creativity, marketing more broadly, sometimes, as we know, slips down that priority list.
Do you think that goes back? And I think it was the first question that we asked them, and we asked, in fact, some of them in advance of getting together a handful of questions, which was, how do they define creativity? Who's responsible for it? How does it express itself? One of the things I was struck by was that I would say, and it really was it was a difficult room in some respects, but it was a very attentive, present, and engaged room still, with only a handful of exceptions. So in a universe of 50, 90%, I'd say, really understood that creativity was the responsibility of the entirety of the organization as opposed to just marketing's job. And they looked at it as that kind of broad imperative. Were you surprised by that? I was.
I was really surprised by it. I was even more surprised that it was seemingly not apparent to some of the CEOs that they could also play a role in this. And they could become, as I think we said on the day, the architects of commercial creativity within the organization.
Yeah, that was your language, I think, and I quite love it, because if it doesn't, creativity is either facilitated or stifled by organizational design, organizational incentives, the permission to fuck up, because as one of the CEOs in the room said towards the end of the afternoon, most ideas are bad ideas. That's just the nature of ideas, right? If you don't have the permission to have bad ideas, you're not going to have many good ideas.
Yeah, and that led on to a conversation around urgency as well. Everyone was in that room because they signed up to the premise, understood why they had to be there. But the provocation right from the outset was around, you need to go on this journey.
Yeah.
But what is the cost of not now?
Yeah,
there are lots of competing priorities, but what is the cost? What is the growth that you're leaving on the table by not addressing it today?
Yeah, you actually ended your remarks with with that phrase, "What is the cost of not now?" And it really hit me quite hard. I didn't know your remarks going in. I'm not sure I knew my own.
You'd never know. I couldn't see the seams.
Which our frequent listeners and watchers know. But that, what is the cost of not now is I think a question we should all be asking ourselves about all kinds of things all the fucking time.
Yeah.
And your point about that urgency that was implicit in their attendance, right? Because it wasn't just curiosity; it was urgency. Does that take us back to what you were saying before about kind of the traditional levers of growth? There's certainly, more efficacious in some instances than others, but just kind of a almost desperate search for what is next and what in this very, very difficult and ever-evolving climate will be the unfair competitive advantage.
Yeah, I think it's partly that. I think it's also, to your other point, the reframing of creativity. There's creativity, there's creative marketing. A lot of people are really talking about output there. They're thinking about campaigns. They're thinking about pumping more advertising into the world. That's not what this is about. What we were really talking about was creativity as infrastructure. Really thinking about how you can embed creativity and innovation, by the way, across the entire organization so that it isn't siloed or just sits at the door of the CMO or the creative department.
You've just brought up two things that I think are worth talking about for a second. One, I think your point, and I'm not sure I was as clear on this as you just made it, which is creativity isn't an output, it's an input.
Yeah.
And actually, we did have a speaker who may not have been Chatham, who talked, and we're outing you, Tor, and we'll get your permission to be sure, and we'll edit if not. But Tor Myron from Apple,
Sure.
who was Apple being your creative marketer of the year, right?
Yeah.
In a conversation with me, opened the forum. And one of the things that we talked about was, Apple today is well known for being Apple, actually,
Yeah.
and everything that surrounds that, for being a consistently creative enterprise, from product to marketing and everything in between. One of the things Tor talked about was how that was facilitated from an organizational perspective, how that was protected, nurtured, prioritized. Did you have any takeaways from that?
I think it was interesting to see the takeaways and the reactions to the conversation that you were having.
Yeah.
Because I think someone very adeptly observed, and this is sort of cheating the system a bit, but they mentioned that for some organizations, maybe it would be better to reframe creativity as innovation. Because when you do that, suddenly you're talking to organic growth and your organic growth strategy.
Yeah.
Innovation speaks the language of CEOs and the shareholders.
One of the things we talked about, to your point, and that was going to be the second thing I got to, which is, does in fact the word creativity have a branding problem? Because there were CEOs who, exactly to what you just said, you use the word innovation, you use the word disruption, maybe even imagination, get trite and cliche, thinking outside the box, embrace it and understand it differently. And it's one of the things that we talk a lot about on this show is the danger of synonyms in business, which is, I say creativity and I mean innovation. You hear me saying creativity and you think, jazz hands and pretty picture ads.
Exactly.
One of the things that I was struck by that Tor said, which was, inside Apple, creatives only report to creatives, which is to say, those who understand create their own kind of language and ecosystem and self-perpetuating culture of creativity that, because Tor, of course, reports to Tim, is protected, to our earlier conversation, and nurtured and facilitated from the top throughout the enterprise, which, of course, began before Tim with Steve, but continues to this day.
Yeah, I think he called it a daily masterclass, which is...
With Steve, yeah.
Yeah. But as you said, it's something that is fiercely protected.
Yeah.
And I think we, as the conversation opened up, got to see the full spectrum of that within the room, where those people who, it was clear, felt they had more to do in that area, and those who were very proud of where they've got to when it comes to protecting the infrastructure that enables the kind of creative we're talking about.
I mean, it's a very hard thing to do.
Absolutely.
Right? While it's very easy to conceptualize that one must do it, and even to have kind of systems in place that if you do not live it, what's that old line? A reputation is built over a lifetime, but torn down in an instant. So too a creative culture, right? Like, the moment people feel like, oh no, I'm actually, and let me see if I can find in my notes. There was a great quote from one of the CEOs about this. I really thought I'd captured this. My notes are incomplete. I have failed you yet again. But it was a great quote, which is just about the cost of not taking that risk, the cost, and going back to
the cost of not now,
the cost of not now, right? And that reframing, not just as a lever of growth, but as not just as additive and accretive, right? But as dilutive in its absence and arguably destructive, at least to value creation, in its absence.
In the questionnaire that we put out before, as you said, we put questions to the participants to get a sense of what was going to be important. So many of them came back saying they were excited to to learn from Apple. At the same time, wanted there to be an acknowledgement that there were a complete range of companies within that room. I guess
Yeah.
the argument is, in a company like Apple, you would hope that creativity is at the center of the business. We also had participation from the likes of, who was in the room? Adobe, Apple, as we said, British Airways, New York Times, Twitch, Saudi Tourism, and then challenger brands like Who Gives a Crap.
Yeah.
So depending on the nature of the organization, the
For
category,
those of our, I believe, U.S.-based listeners in particular, Who Gives a Crap is a toilet paper,
It is indeed.
UK-based. I will confess, not familiar with them myself, but really liked the CEO. He had some really interesting perspectives.
Exactly. And regardless of the category, I think what became really clear is that some of the case studies that emerged, some of the experiences that were shared, they were transferable. You know, you
Yes.
could see people going, okay, well, I'm not in airline, or I'm not in hospitality, but I can see how that can directly apply to my business.
You're spot on, and I've always described it as one of the great. Before I tell you what I was about to describe, I found the quote I was looking for. I knew I had
found
it. The line was, "You won't get fired for the risks you don't take, but you will for the mistakes you do make." And that it ties oddly, I think, to the point you just made, which is that is human nature, and that is human fear, and that is why fear is oftentimes the greatest inhibitor to creativity and the greatest perpetuator of the status quo,
Yeah.
right? Because status quo didn't kill me. I'm just going to keep doing it. I didn't get fired. I'm just going to keep going this way because I don't want to get fired. And what I think is so interesting about the ability to extrapolate lessons across categories, territories, markets is it was the great experience of my career, which is client side, agency side. When you're on the agency side, you realize how actually first time I noticed this, I had a meeting with Apple. This is a long time ago. And I'd had a meeting with Degree Deodorant, right? Within about a week of each other. And this is my first time on the agency side, consultancy side. And I was flying home from the second meeting, and I was like, oh my God, they actually have so much in common in terms of the problem at that moment in time they were trying to solve for. Because we're all selling to human beings, right? Whether a $10 billion cloud computing contract or a can of soda, the architecture of the brain is the same. The reasons we buy are largely the same. And yeah, that kind of cross-pollination was really kind of palpable in the room.
But to your point earlier around system and operational design, some of those challenges are exactly the same.
Yeah.
You know, McKinsey were there. They talked about how the gap between CMO and CEO in terms of metrics, what is important to those respected parties, that gap is only widening.
Yeah.
Which is alarming.
Yeah, no, it's quite terrifying, and in fact, I'm going to have McKinsey on the show. I think in next week or the week after. But again, forgive me for those who are watching as I look. Oh yeah, the data, and McKinsey has released this data. They previewed it at the forum and then released it subsequently. There was in the last 12 months, there was a 20 percentage point decrease in the percentage of chief executives who said, quote, "I'm clear on the role that marketing plays in my company." Really, to me, that is a shared responsibility between the CMO and the CEO, although mostly on the CEO, because you get to walk into the CMO's office and say, why aren't you doing why aren't you delivering against the objectives I laid out for you? And what the fuck are you in fact doing if not that? And so it's one of my other favorite points, and I will talk about this with the McKinsey team in more detail, but 80% of chief executives and just under 80% of CMOs from their reporting said they should be investing more in marketing. If the CEO is telling us that they don't know what the CMO and marketing does, why do 80% of them want to invest more in what they don't know, which is its own form of divide and kind of dissonance? Like, that doesn't make any sense intuitively.
I think what you actually said in the room is, what is the other 80 or 85% doing? Should they be fired, Seth?
Yes, I think I might have said that. I think I might have. Well, actually, that was a different data point.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Which one
sorry.
was that?
It was, I just want to say to our audience, it's like you're here with us, isn't it? This is how raw and real it is.
This was, I think, who owns the customer, because that came up a lot.
Yes, you're exactly right. Something like only 15% of CMOs in that study said they own the customer.
Yeah.
And that they took a customer-centric view of what they did. And I asked the McKinsey folks, I was like, well, should the other 85% be fired? Because
Yes.
if you're not thinking about the customer and you're not customer-centric, what the actual fuck? However, they did, I believe, correct me and say it's actually, to your earlier point, it's not that I don't take a customer-centric view. It's that the responsibility for the customer, there is no holistic view. It's been bifurcated, trifurcated, owned by a chief customer officer, a chief revenue
data
officer, chief data officer, right? And it is disintegration.
Yeah, they distilled it down to this great point, which was when everyone is in charge of the customer growth and acquisition, no one owns the customer.
Yes. Yes. Well, actually, it takes me to this other point, which are the costs of dysfunction, right? Which we've been talking about, but there's such clear data. You cited one data point earlier on the 8% overperformance versus peers. The McKinsey report is filled with clear evidence of business building commercial impact, of not just alignment, that kind of goes without saying, but of creativity well applied broadly across an enterprise, not just in marketing. And yet, despite the data, it is so often siloed. And despite the data, if not in the room where we were, certainly as we look out more broadly across the corporate marketplace around the world, it isn't yet an organizational imperative in the way it should be, which once again brings us back to what's the cost of not now. One of the folks in the room said that your creative intelligence is fast becoming your moat. Was that actually, that might have been you?
That was
you?
me at the top of the day, yeah.
Yeah, see, it was so Chatham House that it didn't come attributed. What were there things that surprised you?
One of the things that really surprised me was the lack of cynicism in the room, actually.
Yeah.
Number one, it was encouraging that we had 60 powerful CEOs, billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars in budget, trillions in market cap, yeah.
Yeah, and influence and everything that comes with that. Showed up, number one, because they bought into the premise, but then were actively engaged. And I think the counter to that, if I'm thinking about what surprised me more broadly, was it was encouraging to see people showing up and really engaging with something that we truly believe in. That creativity
the
is
festival
going to be
well titled.
Well, there you go. It's kind of in our wheelhouse. But then to accompany that, going back to the disconnect that we're seeing with some of the internal operations, is that I was surprised at the lack of movement there.
Yeah.
So the will is there. The lack of movement is even taking a step backwards, according to the data.
It reminds me of a quote that somebody shared with me very early in my career, which is vision without action is nothing but a hallucination, right? Now, I'm a fan of a good, well-protected hallucination recreationally. In business, there is no upside to hallucinations any more than there is in AI. In fact, like in AI, it's kind of dangerous. I want to share one of the lines that I haven't stopped thinking about. We were talking about the organizational imperative,
right?
Talking about how one might, if you haven't yet, create that space, that permission, that culture for creativity to thrive, for innovation to thrive, etc. And somebody made a comment. They said, middle management is where ideas go to die.
Ooh.
And Well, before I tell you what I thought of that and what I've been thinking since, did you have any kind of visceral reaction to that when it was said? Did you shake your head? Yeah, that's my experience too, or was there any kind of a implicit pushback on it?
I think it's, I think there's a lack of accountability that is inherent to that statement,
Say more.
because I think it does sit with the leaders of the business to identify that and do
Yeah.
something about it.
A lack of accountability amongst them.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I completely agree with that.
If something has been pushed to the middle to be figured out or solved without the right direction, infrastructure, as we keep saying, all the tools to make a success of it, then the whole thing falls down anyway.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I will say that that was where I got. It wasn't where I started. My
Go
first
on.
reaction was as a former agency person, I'm like, oh yeah, it's true, right? Like the number of people, if you represent and if your client is a company across brands, a big global enterprise, the number of people who can say no to an idea is almost infinite, while the number of people who can say yes, you can count on, sometimes two fingers. And so middle management is often not where ideas go to die, but where they end. And however, to your point about accountability, the job of middle management, and even kind of the phrase I recognize, I want to put it in quotes because
Yeah,
it
yeah.
sounds implicitly pejorative,
Yes,
and,
yeah.
and it ought not be, is in fact only to surface what they think is in the best interests up the pipeline, to do what they think is in the best interest of the business. And to your point about the absence of accountability, if they are not clear on how they are responsible for moving the business forward, then yeah, it's not where good ideas go to die. It's where bad ideas go to die,
Yeah.
right? That's their job, or an element of their job. But I've really I've continued thinking about it because I think maybe that's the opportunity, which is to ensure, again, in quotes, middle management is where creativity, like so many other organizational imperatives, either lives or dies.
Yeah, I think it also follows quite a archaic view of how companies work as well. That you have senior leadership up here, which pushes a problem to middle management to figure out,
Yep.
versus giving the permission for middle management and the tier below, by the way, to have such a culture of innovation that ideas bubble up organically.
It's interesting to your point. I've been reading a book lately. It was written about 15 years ago, maybe not quite, called The Outliers. And the author will forgive me for not remembering their name. But The Outliers took a look at, I think, 9 chief executives who,
Right.
based on their definition, the author's definition, had completely outperformed their peers in a given time period on shareholder equity value created. And I knew a handful of the chief executives. I'd never heard of the others, that their results were remarkable, and only sad that I did not have the opportunity to invest in them. One of the clear through lines was decentralization as an organizational philosophy,
Right.
which is, very few people kind of at the quote unquote corporate level. Now, these were with a handful of exceptions, not global enterprises. So it's worth saying that. But decentralized, pushing decisions down to those closest to the customer, the market, the
exactly.
consumer. I don't know that it's made me rethink my own management perspectives and philosophies, but it's certainly making me think about them anew. Well, I have a team of just me, so we are both top heavy and very decentralized. Were there any other? There were like a couple of other things that leapt out to me, some verbatims. Anything that resonated with you?
I think about some of the other speakers, and many thanks to all of the speakers that took part in our
Yeah.
inaugural forum. It became really clear, or certainly I saw eyes light up or people lean in when they were genuinely speaking the language of the CEO, rather than some of the arguments that we may have heard previously, or that might resonate more with a CMO, for example. And I thought Interbrand did a really good job of that when they talked about the analysis that they'd done of, I think, 50 of the biggest companies in the world, how they are performing when it comes to their creative output this time, not necessarily infrastructure, and how that output, in other words, those campaigns or examples of creativity, are outperforming competitors when it comes to EBIT and when it comes to market cap,
Yeah.
which is not always the way this kind of thing is presented.
Yeah.
So I think very refreshing for a CEO to sit up and say, okay, now you're talking.
Well, I think what they spoke to, what you're talking to now, is the imperative to, and it really should go without saying, but it does not.
Yeah.
The imperative to make a business case first, second, and always, because what is marketing but a business strategy? That's all it is.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't think that's easy, but yeah, unless there's a commercial case, you're not speaking. What's the first rule of comedy and marketing? Know your audience.
Yeah.
And too many marketers do not know their audience, and they go in talking about things that just don't matter. And I've been thinking a lot. We talk about culture as marketers constantly. By the way, appropriately. I can't think of the last time I heard 5 marketers in a month talk about commerce, talk about commercial returns, talk about commercial efficacy, and it's we, because the art and practice, even in its own silo, which it should not be, it should not live. Marketing should not live within marketing alone. We can confuse the strategy that is the business strategy as our own objective, and in that moment, things get lost.
Agree with you. What did you find surprising? What stood out?
I think I don't know that I would describe this as surprising, but I loved the illustration where one of the chief executives said, and I am quoting, "Creativity is solving regulatory issues in 50 countries with imagination," right? There was another who talked about the efficacy and how creating a culture of creativity meant found staff satisfaction scores going up.
Yes.
The ability to recruit and retain talent improving, the relationships with customers becoming more facile and better, and all of their quality metrics going up. Which again takes us back to the earlier point, which is despite the data, anecdotal and quantitative, fewer are embracing it than are understanding it. And I wonder if it's what I said earlier about the status quo, which is chief executives, they're just people too, just like us. And they don't want to get fired. They don't want to get, crushed. They're not out there taking unmitigated risk. Well, they may take unmitigated, but certainly not unstrategic risk, at least in their own minds. And I wonder if they too just hold to a status quo because, you referenced this early, right? The lever that is change and transformation, that typically fails more often. Transformation exercises fail more often than they succeed because it makes sense on paper, but then it comes down to the people who have to execute it. And there isn't a lot of people management. Janet Bayliss at BCG talks a lot about that.
I think that's why perhaps this is why so many of them showed up. They know that we talked about some of the exhausted levers. They know how difficult that can be.
Yeah.
And when the metrics coming through, when the data points coming through are so compelling on what, as you say, not what it can do for your business and your growth, but how it can affect the internal organization,
which in turn affects the business and the growth.
Exactly. Is pretty compelling.
Yeah, it's super compelling. All right, with that, a final question for you. Year 1 is done. Feels like 3 years ago, but it's only 4 weeks. What's next? Will there be a year 2?
Do you know what? I think so. This started with an appetite. We saw more CEOs coming to Cannes Lions than ever before. This year was about creating a forum and a space where they could address the issue that was coming to us indirectly.
Yeah.
And I think it's important that we continue to create these spaces and these forums where we can dig into this stuff a bit deeper so that the CEOs, especially the CEOs, have the tools, the data, the ammunition that they need to be able to act upon this, and hopefully they will.
Yeah, I thought it was fantastic, in particular as a year one event.
Thank you, sir.
You know, we ought never expect year one to look like year three. That would be foolhardy. And I'll end the show by kind of quoting you on the record, as opposed to everybody else who was Chatham. Your point earlier about creativity as an input, not just an output. Now, in the world of marketing, creative output had creative input. We all understand that.
Yeah.
But as an organizational imperative, as a growth imperative, to use your as the chief executive, as an architect of commercial creativity, and I think as I applauded it earlier, I would again urge all of us, all the time, both professionally and oftentimes personally, to ask ourselves what the cost of not now is.
Yeah, love that. Well, thank you for playing your part. Thanks for wrangling us on the day as well.
Oh, it was a privilege to be part of it, and thanks for being with me for this conversation. And to our listeners and our viewers, thanks for hanging out with Simon and me on what's, I'm not going to lie, an absolutely stunning show-offy day here in London. The weather is
Shiny and bright out there for once.
Just chef's kiss. If you are a fan of the show, please, you've heard me say it before, smash that subscribe button, give it 5 stars, and please give it a review, because that is how others just like you will find it. We appreciate you. I appreciate you. And see you next time.